Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of New Ideas. And with me is a great friend of the program, Dr. Pat Choate. Pat is an economist, PhD certified economist, I might add. He's probably one of the most brilliant minds, political and economic minds here in the United States. Pat's books like Dangerous Business and Agents of Influence and Saving Capitalism were partially responsible for my shift, my views in capitalism from a straight Reaganomics or sort of libertarian view of free market, pure free markets, all the way to a more balanced and national form of capitalism. Still remain an opponent of socialism, of course, and fascism naturally, and communism, both of us. Pat has served on numerous local, state, and federal governmental commissions. He was the vice presidential candidate for Ross Perot back in 1996. Pat is a jack of all trades. That's all I have to say. So welcome back, Pat. We got a lot to talk about.
Good to be back.
So, Pat, we have a new administration. We are almost 3 months, no, a little over 2 months into the Trump administration. And while there are a couple of scattered but major policies or executive orders that I agree with, like the Golden Dome or Iron Dome over America, as he's termed it, I agree with the emphasis and concerns on the trade deficits, on the loss of manufacturing. I have many concerns about most of Trump's cabinet appointments, with a few exceptions. I have concerns with Ukraine policy, his national security, Doge, and also, frankly, the continued rhetorical shift, which has really been a long time coming. It started during the early during the Reagan years, even the Reagan campaign, and has just moved this rhetorical shift in, frankly, a very callous, anti-working class, anti-middle class, extreme form of bootstrapping and social Darwinism that's less rooted, if we want to talk about Republicans, in Lincoln and Henry Clay, even Eisenhower, whose trade policies you and I don't necessarily agree with. It's a real shift. It's more into a shift to the preeminent American social Darwinists like John Calhoun, William Graham Sumner, Reverend Conwell, who made the famous Cross of Diamonds sermon back in the late 1800s, that extolled the wealthiest men and women, or men back then, as paragons of virtue, while the poor and the working class and the homeless people, well, they're just garbage, and they failed because they are not the elect, or they're innately inferior, or whatever. And I'm very concerned about that continued decline of the conservative movement in the Republican Party towards this callousness for many reasons. So we're going to unpack these issues, and let's start with Ukraine, which is an issue that seems to be very important to you. Now, why is continued American support for Ukraine important? And what is your opinion on how Trump has handled Ukraine, including the televised meeting with President Zelensky?
Well, let's just start off. Our major purpose of the United States foreign policy, going back to Woodrow Wilson going forward, has been the spread of democracy. It's an ideological thing with the United States. It is also a reflection of our values. And part of that has been to contain communism, to contain the Soviet Union, to contain dictatorships as such. And so we wind up after World War II, literally responding with containing Russia. And we successfully did that. But we also had a dual purpose. It was to distinguish in Germany Prussian militarism. I mean, the United States, in effect, has dominated Germany socially for 80 years. And the goal of that is to literally make Germany and make France and make Britain and make the rest of Europe dependent upon the US military. And we see that today, where the European military is really ancillary to the United States and NATO, which we have controlled, which we have run the command and control systems under. The mistake that Trump is making is to remove our influence and our power, both moral, soft power, military power, from Europe. We're entering a phase now, which I greatly fear. Germany is going to rearm. They're under the process of doing that right now. Poland is already rearming. They're requiring every able-bodied man to go through military training. Poland and Germany, I would predict by the end of the Trump administration, will both be nuclear powers. They will not depend on France or Britain to provide their nuclear shield. They would depend on us. They're going to be a military power again. And literally, that has proven disastrous in the early and middle 20th century. So U.S. influence diminishing inside Europe, allowing that independence of military, frightens the hell out of me for my grandkids specifically. Not for you, not for me, but a dynamic, a toxic dynamic is going to be released, I'm afraid. So the first step in that is to contain Russia. I mean, quite literally, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, subsequent presidents were very correct in contain Europe. And as parts of the old Soviet Empire break away, is to give them freedom and bring them into the European Union, promote democracy, etc. But us be the shield against the Soviet Union. The costs that we have against the costs that we will likely incur are trivial in that sense. So that's why I strongly support that the United States at this point get a peace in place inside Ukraine, give Ukraine the security agreements that it needs, try to rebuild the relationship inside NATO. It is not a good thing when NATO military leaders meet without the U.S. even in the room. It is not a good thing for us. So that's my concern, Ukraine and the European, us cutting them adrift.
Yeah, no, I think you make a lot of interesting points there. What do you see, before I give, of course, my point of view? You mentioned you're concerned about the independent rearmament of countries, particularly you mentioned France and Germany. What do you foresee in the future potentially happening, the potential blowback of that happening by the time your grandkids are older, they're come of age as adults?
Well, the first thing, France's nuclear power is totally independent of the United States. We have no control of it. They have about 250 nuclear weapons. They have the means to deliver them by submarines, by air, by missile. And so France has an independent course. I'm really not worried about France. But when you wind up in Germany, the far right, which literally hates the United States, it's a neo-fascist party, they got 30% of the vote. Imagine them taking control and deciding that some of the border adjustments that were made after World War II are unfair and that they feel aggrieved, or that someone there can build up an aggrievement among the German population, and they demand, border adjustments as such. You've got all kinds of potential ethnic, historic disagreements that can pop up. That is not good for the United States.
That is an interesting point of view, and it kind of rubs both ways. There is something you're familiar with this called blowback, and
Right.
sometimes you don't know what type of governments will come in power. And this is actually something I was researching. For those of you out there in the audience who also follow me on Substack, I'm sorry I have not written much. I've been buried in Grok 3, doing tons of research of historical significance as well as arcane historical information. One of the things, Pat, I was researching, I mean, I've written about it already and researched it a ton, is the blowback where, for example, let's say in Iran, you had the Shah. And when you look at the Shah, objectively, yes, he was in many ways a U.S. ally, many ways. He also played with the Soviets too as well, importing weapons and all the rest. I'm not going to get into the arcane issue of Iranian politics under the Shah. But what happened was we armed them to the hilt with the cutting edge weapons, and then we pulled the rug under the Shah. And I'm not a fan of the Shah's political system. He was an imperial fascist, essentially. I mean, when you look at the ideology and the policies, you have belligerent nationalism, extreme forms of state control over the economy, militarism, the whole 9 yards, authoritarianism. All those F-16 fighters, cutting edge, M60 tanks, weapons production that the United States, the West Germans gave Iran, fell right into the hands of Khomeini. And they were able to use that for both repression in the war against Iraq. Iraq I was not a fan of, obviously, back under the Ba'ath Party. And also to promote international terrorism throughout the world. You bring up a point, AFD, that's the far-right party in question, the right-wing so-called populist party that's pro-Russia, that is increasingly pro-China in many ways. They gained a lot of support, and I might add, they had support from elements of MAGA, including Elon Musk himself, very publicly on Twitter or /X. So there is that chance. You don't.
And J.D. Vance.
And J.D. Vance, yeah, thank you. So there is that chance. Now, what do I think about the situation? I think I'm of two minds on this. I like the fact that Europe is becoming self-sufficient, because there are times where the United States has not always been the best for many reasons. It's always complicated, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether Iran, with the Shah being eased out by Carter through General Husser, Anastasio Somoza, not a fan of him. I don't like the conservative apologia for Somoza's rule, but Carter denied weapons shipments and spare parts to Somoza's Guardia Nacional and fighting the Sandinista communists. The same thing with Batista, where our former U.S. ambassador, who is not exactly entirely a Batista supporter, Ambassador Earl E.T. Smith, had testified before Congress after the Cuban Revolution that the Eisenhower administration, through the State Department, held up shipments of M1 rifles that Cuba under Batista paid for, that were supposed to be used for the Cuban army. And this is not saying I'm endorsing Batista, Somoza, or the Shah, to give some examples, or Nguyen Van Thieu or Lon Nol in Southeast Asia, or the royalist government of Suvarnabhumi, which was more of a neutralist government in Laos, necessarily. But we're not always the best ally, and Europe has to become more independent. And at least Germany and France especially have the strongest industrial bases in Europe. Britain is a disaster. We have, yes, some people on the right have argued that the labor unions had a big role to play in that in the 1970s. I'm not sure about that either way. I might leave that to you. But Thatcher made and New Labour all gutted Britain's industrial base. They need to get industrial policies stat. So I think this could be a good opportunity for Europe, especially the countries that have destroyed their industrial base because of ideology and greed. That's a good thing. Because the United States, as far as I'm concerned, what I'm seeing right now is we can't be counted on to support potentially Europe. Now, why is Russia problematic? Well, and this is a very controversial thing I'm going to say that's not popular. The Cold War never really ended. And this is according to defectors. This is even during the 1990s. This is one of the things I agree with our other good friend of the show, J.R. Nyquist. It's one of his strong points where the defectors that even I've read and the ones that he has contact with, military and intelligence defectors from Russia, Sergei Tretyakov, Alexander Litvinenko, Stanislav Lunev, Ken Alabak, or Kenatin Alabekov, and others who defected after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they all said this. We have Russia funding far-right populist parties, and communist and leftist parties are having ties with them throughout Europe. Why? To neutralize NATO. Russia already has bases and allies, so to speak, not bases, military bases, but military and intelligence cooperation with Orban's Hungary, with Belarus under Lukashenko, which is basically an unreconstructed communist dictatorship, as also Serbia, which goes now back in the hands of Milosevic's, not Milosevic is dead, but Milosevic's Socialist Party of Serbia, where they have cooperation with China and Russia, including cooperation with Russian GRU Spetsnaz, for example. So we have these bases of operations. The Cold War is still on. They're backing Die Linke in Germany, the AfD, the RNFN in France, Podemos in Spain. Rumor has it they're back by Venezuela and Iran, which are both Russian and Chinese allies. I know I'm going on, but for first-time listeners or people tuning in, people think, oh, the Cold War is over. Russia is not attached to any communist culture internally. No, 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 and no. You look at the Russian media monitor of Julia Davis, who's on X and Twitter and other media and social media outlets. She reproduces all the time videos of Russian state television programs where the hosts are talking about dominating Europe and dominating the United States, and whatnot, and wishing for the collapse of Western liberal democracy in Western Europe and the United States. I'm not even going to go into Russia's fingerprints in the United States. Now, look, I don't want war with Russia. I'm not even saying that we should back regime change in Russia or China, but we need to be cognizant of the threats out there and take a very cold, analytical look. And Europe has to do what they need to do to survive. But I think what Trump has done with Ukraine, I think it's been frankly disgusting. I mean, withdrawal of cybersecurity and cyber warfare, countering cyber warfare from Russia. You heard about that. That's something that Secretary of Defense and the Department of Defense under Pete Hegseth has put through. You have one of the areas I do agree with Biden. There were controls put on, Russian, SVR, FSB, Putin oligarchs, which are arms of the state in Russia. Biden had certain oligarch agencies, the name of it, or one in particular, gotten rid of. You look at who Trump put in his administration. Darren Beatty makes posts all about that are pro-CCP, pro-Russia, within the view that, America is a woke crap hole in these countries. The governments are better and they're not threats to the United States. You look at Tulsi Gabbard, who needs no introduction. Her views are of public record. You look at Kash Patel, who learned, as the director of the FBI, who has learned that in media reports that he has ties with Russian oligarch documentary producers, as well as Chinese businesses. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So really, this is a total travesty. I think we need to support Ukraine as much as we can, as much as our limits can, with weapons, with aid, and with diplomatic and moral support. Why? And you mentioned it in a previous show, because Ukraine has a lot of is a mineral treasure house. Those fall
Yes.
in the hands of Putin. Putin has a revenue generator, and he could export those goods, get hard currency, euros and dollars and yen, uh, for those
It
goods. That
would take the place of oil and gas.
exactly. And like China and OPEC, they could use those minerals as leverage against the United States and Europe if those go in the hands. And we know that China and OPEC have used their resources as leverage for a very, very long time. So that concerns me. And we also have billions of dollars of trade with Europe. I looked up the trade statistics. I mean, we import chemicals, electronics, automobiles, trucks, et cetera, from Europe. Pharmaceuticals, exactly. I mean, Switzerland and Germany are huge producers of pharmaceuticals.
France.
And France, very true. So if those countries get neutralized by Russia, well, what are we going to do? So the domino theory worked. Countries did fall to communism. The New Left and the sort of communist-aligned revisionists during the Cold War were actually very wrong. Because if you don't take a firm stand against totalitarianism, whether Nazi or fascist or communist, the dominoes will fall. And it's not to say that we didn't support very bad leaders in the process. We also supported many good leaders and movements in the process as well. But the point being is that if Ukraine falls, that's going to prove to be a strategic disaster for the United States. Is there anything to add? Is there anything to disagree with? Do you have additional ideas about what I said? What are your thoughts?
I would extend the thought. I am concerned about how the Republican Party has become more accepting of Putin and Russia and more tolerant of what Russia is doing. To me, it was very shocking that a Republican Congress held up aid to Ukraine for 6 months. That is shocking when you get to it. One of the bulwarks that we've had against Russia, literally since the time of Woodrow Wilson, was the Republican opposition to communism and to Russia as such. And we're seeing that watered down strongly. When you wind up with Mitch McConnell supporting a Russian oligarch's takeover of a major facility, a factory inside Kentucky, and arguing for him, when you see the Speaker of the House saying that he really doesn't care to support Ukraine and holding aid for 6 months, when you have the Vice President of the United States saying, I don't give a fig what happens to Ukraine, that is worrying to me.
I agree. I am very worried about that. It's like, it's like how the Democrats, the left wing of the Democratic Party, viewed our allies during the Cold War and American national security needs. It's now flipped around. Now, before I go into, I think for the audience, and I want to, for the audience's sake, I've discussed this, of course, with Jared Nyquist and some of our other guests, but I wanted to get your take. Why did the Republican Party flip on Russia? And when do you sense that happened?
I think that really began. It began to take effect in the 70s. And it occurred as the Republican Party was bit by bit taken over by the Koch brothers and a whole series of ultra wealthy individuals. And the irony, of course, is the founder of Koch Industries, the current Charles Koch's father, created a strong movement in the 1950s, anti-communism, though he made his fortune helping build oil refineries inside Russia for Stalin in the 1930s. And bit by bit, what happened inside the Republican Party, and I say this, let me turn the phone off here. I say this as someone who began his career as working for the first Republican governor of Oklahoma, Henry Bellman, who became a senator, second Republican governor, Dewey Bartlett, who became a senator, first Republican governor of Tennessee in the Nixon administration and in the Ford administration. So, quite literally, I was involved in people who were strongly anti-communist. But what happened inside the Republican Party, the moderates, the Rockefeller wing of the party, et cetera, that group of Republicans were driven out. And essentially, what happened is we had people who supported a more materialistic view and a hatred of the federal government as such. And with that, you literally wound up, I think, with more and more people there who were not worried. And I think you put your finger on it. In the 1990s, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, they thought the threat was over. You're right. The Cold War wasn't over. It just entered a different phase as such. And what has happened, there's just not been the focus and the recognition of a real danger here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that point. I think there are a number of reasons. It's a very complicated story of how this started in the Republican Party. I see if I could pull up some quotes here to illustrate.
Well, let me talk about the Democratic Party's contribution to this.
Sure, please.
With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the administration of George H.W. Bush and the administration of Bill Clinton advocated a position that said, okay, the political Soviet Union has been broken. And what we will do is we will take China and we'll take the Soviet Union and we'll convert them to our ways with trade. We will have a very liberal trade regime. And as they prosper, they will accept our ideology. And literally, we put into place NAFTA. We put into place the World Trade Organization. We gave China ascension into the World Trade Organization and gave it the status of an emerging economy as such, under the hopes that capitalism and prosperity would benefit them. What happened is in China, they took advantage of that, quite literally, to take over under very specific planning, one industry after another. They sought autonomy and they sought domination through manufacturing and exports. China had a $1 trillion trade surplus last year. We had a 900 billion trade deficit last year. Amazing reversal of positions. And so literally the Democratic approach was we'll have democracy through trade. And it has failed spectacularly.
It has, and it really has been a bipartisan betrayal. Now, there have been good people sides of the aisle, inside and outside government, that have blown the whistle on that and sounded the alarm. Now, concerning with Russia and even the Soviet Union, I mean, there was always a part of the Republican Party that always had a very big business. Big business was always very powerful within the Republican Party, and I'm not saying that's always necessarily a bad thing. I mean, even before the United States gave official recognition to the Soviet Union in 1933, you had, Herbert Hoover, our president, said that he summarized what our relationship should be with the Soviet Union is no political contact and all the trade we can get. And I think there was commercialism within the Republican Party. And even during the 1920s and early 1930s, before FDR, the United States companies were allowed to send strategic goods to the Soviet Union. DuPont, for example, was a huge offender of that, and they knew, because they even admitted it, that their exports were used by Stalin's Red Army. So there was that knowledge. Now,
Standard Oil.
Yep, many, and then Ford Motor, et cetera, and that's very well documented. Now, in the Republican Congresses, throughout virtually the entire Cold War, there was opposition to trade with the Soviet Union. The softening in the Republican Party was more in presidential administrations. I'm not going to go through the history because it's going to take long, but really today's roots, it started, I think, under Reagan. Now, during the 1980s, there was this, the Soviets were very smart when it came to this. And George Will ironically described how the conservative movement, particularly in the, as you know personally, I'm sure, Pat, the notion of conservative economics really changed starting in the 1970s and even before, but really became apparent in the 1980s. You had Milton Friedman, who famously said, no one, this is in Capitalism and Freedom, no one who buys bread knows whether, and I need about a few minutes to talk about this because it's very complicated, and this is not talked about anywhere, really. No one who buys bread, this is Milton Friedman, knows whether the wheat from which it is made was grown by a communist or a Republican, by a constitutionalist or a fascist, or for that matter, by a Negro or a white. This illustrates how an impersonal market separates economic activities from political views and protects men from being discriminated against in their economic activities for reasons that are irrelevant to their productivity, whether these reasons are associated with their views or their color. The problem with that is the wheat grown by a communist or a fascist is not just some impersonal actor that just wants to buy or sell. When we look at the history of trade by Nazis, by fascists, by communist states, they weaponize trade for many different reasons. And unfortunately, much of the conservative movement, including Elon Musk and many of the people close to the Trump administration, it seems, glorify Friedman uncritically. This thought has taken over the conservative movement lock, stock, and barrel. I thought Trump would kind of reverse that in 2015, 2016. I think in many ways I'm wrong, because in most economic departments and bureaucracies and sectors, Trump is getting advice from the Milton Friedmanites, notably Kevin Hassett, who's the chief of the the National Economic Council, I believe. Now we go to Reagan, and this thought is just all over the place. Trade is everything. Second term of Reagan starts to loosen trade in certain ways with the Soviet Union. We never cut off trade. It was Reagan who lifted Carter's grain embargo, and that grain, quite a bit of it, was diverted to the Soviet Red Army and the KGB. Now, there were other things that Reagan, particularly in his first term, did to contain communism that were very solid, including export controls. But it was very mixed bag. This monolithic policy that people think it is. Now, Gorbachev launched a program to, and I know this sounds like kooky right-wing nut jobbery, but I unfortunately, I do believe it. Gorbachev had a program to use perestroika and glasnost to soften the image of the Soviet Union while they continued to build, while they continued to try to make their economy and industry efficient and their military cutting edge, or tried to. They were deceiving the United States. And there's a declassified document where Gorbachev noted in a July 1988 speech to the assembled leaders of the Warsaw Pact. And he said, this is not some from crazy right-wing person, okay? This is Gorbachev himself from the Cold War International History Project's website at Princeton University. Gorbachev said, a new image of socialism prevents the traditionally right-wing circles in the West to continue dominating the world as they did by using a stereotype image of the enemy, the communist totalitarian monster. This tendency is strengthened by the revival of the anti-military movement in the West. And that's where we get treaties like INF, with Gorbachev and Putin promptly violated. Now, the trade issue. The Soviets knew that Western, including American greed and love of commerce, including growing in sentiment in the Republican Party, was a hook to help them. There is an example of a 1987 discussion between Soviet ruler Gorbachev and Archer Daniels Midland head Duane Andreas, who was a longtime supporter of economic collaboration with the Soviet Union. He was on the organization that used to be called USTEC, the U.S. Soviet Trade and Economic Council. Andreas recommended to Gorbachev that the best way to sway conservatives towards the USSR was, quote, what he termed a financial appeal. Gorbachev himself noted in 1988, quote, normal business relations with states of the opposing system are, among other things, a blow to anti-Sovietism and anti-communism, thus weakening the reactionaries, meaning people like me, or
Right.
you,
Right.
pressure on democratic gains and aspirations. So you have that creates an atmosphere to soften further COCOM, trade embargoes, export controls, which were not always enforced. It was a small agency, COCOM. I looked at how many people they had officially, and it was ridiculously small. So when we look at that, that created an atmosphere where we fell asleep. We ignored Russia despite its severe economic problems, massive investments, helped by the United States in the 1990s, both under George Herbert Walker Bush and especially Bill Clinton, all kinds of loans, technology, whatnot, supercomputers sold under Clinton, who deregulated trade against Russia and China even further. We just didn't think it was a threat. And the few voices out there that were on the right, like J.R. Nyquist, like if you know Don McIlvaney or knew the name, some within the John Birch Society, those voices were marginalized essentially. They were viewed as kooks and crazies, and so were the defectors too as well from Russia that defected during the 1990s and warned us. But there were people that warned against it, but they were marginalized. That continued under G.W. Bush. Now, this really gained steam under Obama when, despite the massive human rights violations and military buildup, virtually every Tea Party Republican in the House and the Senate voted for an Obama initiative for permanent normal trade relations with Russia. And some of them, like John McCain, for example, knew that Russia, and Orrin Hatch knew that Russia, because they said so, that Russia was a bad actor, but they still voted for it. Nevertheless, when you have individuals like Michelle Bachmann and Newt Gingrich, they also saw, which has popped up on the right, even as far back on the Stalin era, when Captain Edward V. Rickenbacker of Eastern Airlines claimed in the 1943 visit that Russia basically was becoming, disciplined, and then they kept their workers in line and prevented strikes. Some of that pining for the Gilded Age. Well, some conservatives during the Tea Party era viewed China as that model. Michelle Bachmann said, if you look at China, they don't have food stamps, they save for their retirement security, no welfare, everything else, and Newt Gingrich saying you want to create jobs as rapidly as China. China pays zero capital gains taxes. And if if we did what China did in that respect, we'd have millions of new jobs. But they said this. So there was also this view that Russia and China were becoming these sort of Gilded Age utopias that they really pine for. Now, but there was elements of the Republican Party that also did what I call the conservative two-step, and the Mitt Romney, presidential candidate in 2012, ran for president, and in the party platform, they talked about Russia as a threat, and definitely Romney, to his credit, did. But in the platform in 2012, endorsed, of course, or it has to be at least tacitly approved by Romney, they call for PNTR, approval for PNTR for Russia. I call it the conservative two-step. Then when Trump comes along, the liberals in the Democratic Party, in the corporate Democrats, most of them voted for PNTR for Russia. They then switched immediately into a position that raised concerns about Russia being a national security threat. And they were right, but it was a little hypocritical on the Democratic Party, to say the least. And that propelled the Republican Party, because they were so gaga over Trump. He basically put this spell on the Republican electorate, especially not only in 2016, but especially in 2020 and 2024, that, well, if you're against Trump, you're bad. So, and the Republican Party and Trump became more, MAGA became more about owning the liberals, even if it meant embracing or downplaying or denying the threat of Russia. Owning the libs, and this view that Russia and China were basically fighting against what was viewed as the woke left virus too as well. I'll give you an example and then I'll wrap up. Jared Taylor, who, of American Renaissance, he's a bit of a white racist. He wrote, China doesn't have a lot of blacks and Hispanics. It doesn't have race riots. It's not spending billions on diversity. It isn't trying to turn unteachable Somalis and Hondurans into anesthesiologists. All the billions and all the incredible moral energy we waste on racial goose chases the Chinese have used to build their country. Now, MAGA, I'm not saying the entire movement is racist, but there's a lot of those sentiments in Jared Taylor's statement in muted form, with certain exceptions, is in the MAGA camp. China, but especially Russia, is led by Putin, who portrays himself as a Christian, as a nationalist, as a manly man riding on that horseback, bare-chested. That appeals to the right. The right wing that is very tired of this sort of woke, effeminate, wussy kind of culture in the United States. And they're looking and they're attracted to strong leaders. And the Russians have taken advantage of that. Now, when I was searching on Grok 3 on X and searching quotes about this, the Russians, and there were FSB memos that apparently were leaked in the Navalny leaks and elsewhere, where the FSB were aware of this, and the SVR, that's the Russian intelligence services, they were aware of these conservative movement feelings, and they just basically took advantage of it and exploited it to the hilt. So that's how we came to this point. And I apologize to you, Pat, and the audience for going on and on, but this is important history that you're not going to get on Fox News, OAN, mainstream media. Does this make sense, Pat?
It's the reality of what happened. The problem is you're not going to get it in history books. that people take in college or high school, etc. It's an unacknowledged part of history. I take a look at China. As you know, I've written extensively about it. What China has, and what most of the MAGAs do not understand, is they have created efficient communism. They have a communist state where they have put behind it a truly competitive and efficient economy.
Mhm.
And they're matching the two in their power politics. I mean, quite literally, you take a look, and I doubt if most people understand how extensive China has extended its soft influence with infrastructure projects, highways, roads, bridges around the world, where they're swapping their indebting small countries to China to get access and control of their minerals. They have control of ports around the world, and extensive control of ports. They Most people also don't realize that 95% of the export industries in China are owned by the Chinese government. And so all of a sudden, what we're competing against is a very, very efficient, economically efficient communism. And in Russia, I mean, Putin has made, a horrible strategic mistake with his invasion of Ukraine. And quite literally, the choice that we have is to bail him out of that mistake or not. He's destroyed more than half of his military equipment inside Ukraine, his tanks, his trucks, his armored personnel carriers. He has literally electrified Finland and Sweden into joining NATO as such. He has resulted in almost a doubling at this point of military expenses by Europe and by NATO countries. And what he has done is he has killed one of his big economic successes, his sale of oil and gas into Europe as such. Putin's, what he thought he could do and what he might have been able to achieve was to make Europe dependent on Russian gas and oil. And he, on his second pipeline going into Russia, if that had allowed or been completed, he would have made that almost complete, and he could have exerted that sort of soft power against Europe. So basically, what we have now is a situation in flux. Will we bail Russia out? Russia's economy is 1/8 that of Europe. Its population is 1/3 that of Europe. Its economy is roughly 1/12 that of the United States. Its population is less than half the size of the United States. The Chinese are in a position where 200 plus billion of that surplus is to the United States. Another 200 billion is to Europe. I mean, here is a strategic moment where we can contain China and we can contain the Soviet Union, and perhaps at least have a world trade regime, a world order that can be stabilized over the past 20 years. The question is, are we up to providing the leadership to do that at this pivot point, truly, in history? And I'm concerned, Nevin, that we're not. That we're squandering an opportunity that is historic.
What measures do you oppose by the Trump that have been implemented, the Trump administration, that he's done to Ukraine, as well as also give us some comments on how Vice President Vance and President Trump treated President Zelensky in the White House that was on TV. What was your, I mean, look, I respect your views and your analysis. What did you sense about that meeting? Who was in the wrong? And what is your commentary on the specific policies that Trump has done with Ukraine, for example, too, as well?
Well, first of all, I think it is very much to Trump's credit that he is trying to achieve the peace agreement that he is trying to get. I think it's very much to his credit. Something that has received virtually no attention is his insistence in this peace agreement that the United States take over the operation of the nuclear plants inside. If that is done, basically, it would make it an attack on the United States for Russia to attack those facilities. And those facilities are old technology, and it would be disastrous, just like Chernobyl, if something. So for the United States to take control and implicitly give the security agreement to that, I think is great. Where I think he is wrong is really to try to restore Russia's status as a major economic power. It's a regional economic power with an economy that is in great difficulty. I mean, the flip answer is Jim Carville, who says Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. So I think we should do all that we can to keep them into a proper perspective as a second tier regional power. So that's the first thing. As to Ukraine, I think, just a minute, let me take care of this phone.
No problem. No problem.
As to the agreement, we must be ready to pressure Russia on this to get a ceasefire, to get a 30-day ceasefire. We need to get the Europeans into those negotiations. They need to be at the table along with Ukraine, because we're going to need them as a peacekeeping force inside Ukraine. We should allow and encourage Ukraine to become part of NATO. And we should encourage the European Union to take Ukraine as a member of the European Union. But in no circumstances should we elevate Russia to great power status. It is like North Korea. We should treat them almost like North Korea. We'll do some trade with them. They're a nuclear power. They use that as a menace against Europe and the United States.
Right.
And so that we need to neutralize. We should do everything possible to make sure that Poland and Germany feel safe and do not develop a nuclear force as such. The blowback on that is too unpredictable.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. I agree with you. I have a couple of follow-up questions before we get into Doge and Trump's domestic economic policies. One thing I will say about Russia, I mean, it's authoritarian, their economic system, contrary to what some over the years have said. I know Ben Shapiro said that Russia, even back when it was not cool to say this about Russia, or maybe it was back, I think in like during the Obama years, Ben Shapiro wrote that Russia's economy, even though Russia is a threat, we still can work with them, and their economy is, much more liberalized and everything. I would disagree. When you actually look at the academic studies of Russia's economy, the oligarchs are tied in with the state. They're arms of the state. Russia's industries, so quote unquote private industries, are still very heavily controlled and subsidized by the Russian state. Very protectionist economy. There's a lot of state ownership of the economy. Putin in recent years, even before Ukraine, has denounced neoliberalism and capitalism and whatnot. So this is not a capitalist economy that even you and I, who are more statist than someone like Ben Shapiro, those are policies you and I would never support. And it's very similar how many American conservatives, even particularly during the 1980s, a number of them, not all of them, misunderstood the nature of China's reforms, that it was mirrored on Lenin's new economic policy and not Milton Friedman or Frederick Bastiat. So when we take a look at Russia, I will say, compared to the United States, the strengths they do have, at least on paper, are they don't outsource their critical production. Yes, they trade with the West, and they continue to get trade from the West and Asian countries and intermediaries, varying goods, machine tools, electronics, microprocessors, all the rest of it. But they still are a major steel producer, a major oil producer. They don't outsource their rare earth metals because it's cheaper. Russia, up until, I would say, PNTR was revoked by Biden, and Russia, certainly under Obama and George W. Bush, was dumping steel, as you very well know, Pat, in the American market. They were a world's huge steel producer. They produced a lot of goods that we didn't pursue. And again, looking through Grok 3, through the archival and news information they quote, the Russians make fun of us and say, who the hell are you? I mean, Putin said this supposedly in some form at the Valdai Industrial and Economic Forum. Say, who the hell is the United States to lecture us on economics? You have a paper casino capitalist speculative economy. Well, at least we produce things, is what he said, basically almost word for word or by implication. And, in a weird way, they're right. So they have those advantages. We outsource our production. We obsess and incentivize over maximizing shareholder value, stock buybacks, leverage buyouts, mergers and acquisitions, where Russia's focused at least on production. If they get their act together and they boost their population, which are, of course, their weaknesses, the efficiency and corruption issues and the birth rate issue, they can be something. I mean, look what happened, to take an extreme example, what Stalin did once the Axis, led by Germany, invaded. The Red Army, as big as it was, they were defecting to the Germans. Many of them were collaborating with the Germans and becoming literal fascists for the Nazis. As the Nazis were persecuting the captured Soviet peoples, they still collaborated. But Stalin, through terror, through massive aid transfers from Britain, from the United States under Lend-Lease, and usage of terror and appealing to Soviet patriotism, and also mentioning, it's not propaganda, because in this case it was fact, the horrible brutalities of the Axis forces led by Germany, they were able to turn that war around in favor for the Soviet Union. So I think you're 100% correct in everything you said about Russia, but I also give those words of caution too as well, because the United States has a lot of strengths, but we also have a lot of weaknesses that I think that many understand, but nobody's doing enough about it, because it would require radical changes to the prevailing economic paradigms that we've basically absorbed as fact, as economic law, not to be deviated from. But everything else I totally agree with. We have to support Ukraine, but I also have and we have to rebuild our alliances with Europe. But here's a question for you, Pat. I'm going to throw you a curveball. You ready for this?
Ready.
All right. You have mentioned and documented how American allies in Japan, European Union, but in Japan, they're allies. But they also have abused the alliances too by being two-faced about trade with NATO's enemies and Japan's enemies, and China, North Korea, Vietnam, the Soviet Union, East Germany, etc. Same with the what used to be called the EEC, or the Common Market countries, which then became the European Union. And they also, Japan and the European Union, because we wanted to keep them as allies during the Cold War, the EEC countries and Japan in this case, and continued after the Cold War, we tolerated or even encouraged massive trade abuses. How would you balance the need to maintain these critical alliances with, as well as holding the European Union countries and Japan accountable against abuses that could further destroy our industrial base or preclude us from rebuilding our industrial base? How do you answer that? Because that's a difficult situation.
Okay. I mean, I think we can cut the Gordian knot by a couple of swift actions. Let us start with acknowledging that the global trade system that we have, the United States created. It was the World Trade Organization. We conceived that in Bretton Woods in 1944. It was then called the International Trade Commission. The United States Senate would not accept it. And it was finally killed in 1950. And so what we did is we created something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, where the primary objective up until the 1970s was to negotiate the reduction of tariffs around the world. Tariffs were the primary trade barrier before then. And by the 1970s, it was very obvious that what countries, notably Japan, were doing is they were literally distorting trade through subsidies, through a lack of market access, through cartel operations, etc. And so in the Carter round, which was called the Tokyo round of negotiations, the United States moved to put into place mechanisms that would deal with these non-tariff barriers. And the world simply didn't respond. They didn't obey the commitments that they made. The United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, designed something called the World Trade Organization. George H.W. Bush created that. Bill Clinton put it into place. There was one major flaw, and it is the disparate treatment of taxes. And so what we allowed in that is if a country uses a value-added tax, as we've discussed before, they can apply that value-added tax onto American imports. So every American import into Europe must pay an additional minimum of 20% on the price when it comes in. And at the same time, those countries are allowed on every export to rebate that to the manufacturer locally. So if they send a Volkswagen to the United States, the 20% value added tax that they pay domestically, the German government rebates it to Volkswagen. So we have a double trade barrier. Our goods are taxed 20%. Their goods are subsidized 20% coming into the U.S. market. The simplest thing is for President Trump to reorder the World Trade System and basically say that other countries cannot do that. They cannot literally impose a VAT on U.S. Imports and that they cannot give a VAT export. And the way we deal with that is very simple. We have a VAT tariff. We simply say to any country, whatever the value of that VAT is that you're charging, we will impose a tariff on that coming into the United States. And it will be removed when the other country literally makes a reduction or elimination of that VAT subsidy and that tax inside their country. In other words, we don't try to negotiate this multilaterally. We impose it. We use that $1 trillion trade deficit that 1.1 trillion in good deficit that we have, we use that beneficially to our advantage. We just simply say, you will not have access to this market. For most countries, that will be enough to persuade them to do that. Now, as to the question of subsidies or other non-tariff barriers, we can deal with that with countervailing duties. But the big thing is the VAT. And so we need to radically alter the global trade system so it is not discriminatory against U.S. exports and subsidize their imports into this country.
Yeah,
One stroke.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
One stroke.
Yep, one stroke. Yeah, and I think if Trump, do you think Trump and his administration, look, we have Peter Navarro, we have Michael Stumo, who we knew from the Coalition for Prosperous America. They have been appointed, or Stumo has been appointed. Peter Navarro, a long time, advocate for reforming our free trade. He's appointed. How do you think the Trump administration is doing so far in handling trade negotiations, as well as also dealing with the China issue? Before we go on to Doge.
I think so far they've been confused. I think it's been chaotic. Mm-hmm. They have allowed it to be personal, where Trump threatens countries with tariffs, off topic, truly. I think you're going to see on April 2nd what they called Liberty Day, when they introduce the new trade regime. I think we're going to see them deal with the VAT. Navarro has been criticized, and literally he has legitimately been criticized on many of his actions when he gets into talking about COVID, et cetera. But Peter Navarro is a very good PhD from Harvard economist. You go and read his economic books, and he's right on the money. He has been prescient about China. He's done some of the most detailed work on China. He has, and Wilbur Ross did a major paper on the VAT in 2017 on that. He's right on the money on that. I think we're going to see them take on, and certainly Michael Stumo, who I know fairly well, mm-hmm. Is very much focused on that. I think that what we're going to see is them take on the VAT. If we're going to have a global trade war, and if we're going to have a recession out of it, which we're going to have, I think, then let's have some benefit on the other side when we come out of it. And that benefit is to stop the weaponization of that against the American economy.
And it is, as you've mentioned, even in interviews from years ago, even before we met, the value-added tax, many countries obviously use it, as you just indicated, but also it is I think and correct me if I'm wrong, if I misheard you from older interviews, it is WTO compatible, yes. Too. So yeah. that should be in something, a hook that we can get in, because the VAT functionally serves as a tariff, as you had just said, and has said in other occasions.
It is a de facto tariff. In fact, it was created by France in the 1950s, and the United States tolerated it because we didn't want France to go communist. But over time, with this exemption from by the GATT and then now the WTO, it is now used by every other nation as a trade weapon against the United States. I am hopeful we see this addressed in this April 2nd. If Trump can eliminate that, that will be a major economic achievement of his administration.
Yeah, and look, I would be the first one to support it. There are some things I do support, as I indicated earlier on other shows with other guests, that I support with Trump if he does something correct. There was a piece, for example, where Trump is also, and I saw this on X, it's a legitimate news piece, and not particularly from a biased source. And I appreciated where Trump has pressed Europe to stop purchasing Russian fuel and energy exports, or is at least pressuring them to do so. I think that's correct. So I think I don't know if you heard about that or not, but I think that is correct. If true, I think that's correct. But also, it does illustrate an earlier point you make that similar to Trump's first administration, the second administration is very confused and chaotic, probably even more so now. It's not coordinated. I think it's because of maybe Trump's personality and leadership style or lack thereof. It's also because there are disparate factions with disparate thought processes that are really truly not on the same page on core issues.
It's a shake. It's the shakeout that happens in the first 100 days in any administration.
Yeah. Personally, I would not govern that way. I would put people who are, like, for example, if I wanted to decouple from China and Russia, I would not put advocates of Reaganomics or big business lobbyists or Wall Street lobbyists, or on the other hand, people that hew to hard left rhetoric like Gabbard and RFK Jr. on those issues. I would appoint people for certain positions that I know that they'll basically stay in their lane or lend their true expertise. People like you, people like J.R. Nyquist, people like Elizabeth Warren, people like Chris Murphy, both senators. I would take a look at Julius Krein of American Affairs. I would take a look at Trevor Loudon for national security, some of the domestic security and radical monitoring, even though I don't agree with him on a lot of domestic policies. And he's a friend of the show and a personal friend of mine. I would put in people like Nick Hanauer, who's a multi-millionaire business person. I would put other advocates of what used to be viewed as what stakeholder or old school American capitalism or paternalistic capitalism. I would put a lot of these people in there because I know they're going to implant the policies that I want. Basically, that the American people really, I think, truly left at their own devices, independent of media brainwashing and political tribalism, support poll after poll. And that's what I would do. It would be an interesting alliance. In some ways, it would be difficult because this is a coalition of very conservative people, with also people that are centrist liberals. I would also appoint Michael Lind, your friend, as one of my chief strategic advisors on domestic policy. I would farm out quite a bit of domestic economic and political and policies to you and Michael Lind. I will tell you that right now. I would give you a job like that.
Well, I had an uncle, to make a point, I had an uncle once that raised racing pigeons. It was a great hobby. And so he would train the pigeons, and then they'd get into these races, and they would put them in these pigeon trailers. And they'd go 50 miles, 100 miles away from home. And it's very interesting. The doors pop open, all the pigeons come out at once. They go to the sky, and they fly in a big circle. And they just fly in this big circle, 10, 15 minutes. And then the pigeons begin to peel off, and they just take off straight towards home. They get their direction, and they're off at 60, 65 miles an hour. I mean, just unbelievable. And I think what happens with any new administration, the first 100 days, they have some direction, but basically they're circling and sorting things out to get the directions, the relationships between the people. April 2nd is, I think, the date in which we see on economic policy, on trade policy, the direction they're taking. If they take on this VAT, and if they have a systemic program, and they take this on as a whole, as the gestalt of this, then they can accomplish great things. And they can revitalize our production capacity inside this country. It's a great opportunity here. And were I advising them, I would just say, let's change the global trade system, and let's change it forever, not just for this administration. Let's put in a realistic change, and let's start off with basically saying, let's deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be as such. If they want communism, they can have communism. If they want socialism, they can have socialism. If they want something in between or some combination, that's it. But let us define what that relationship is with those countries. With Europe, you can do it with plurilateral negotiations with the EU as whole. With China, you got to do it on a country by country basis. The same with Japan, the same with South Korea. There is a great opportunity here.
Yeah, I agree with you too as well. I mean, again, I'm not a fan of regime change actions. I mean, look, yes, I would support democratic exile groups and whatnot, but obviously going to war with countries, I'm very war shy unless an ally, but specifically the United States was attacked. For many reasons, we can go into that a different show. One thing I wanted to add to what you said, if I were advising Trump realistically, I would also add that him, Secretary of Treasury Bessent, Secretary of Commerce Lutnick, Peter Navarro especially, and Peter has appeared on the shows. I've watched a few of them, and he's not bad the way he communicates the trade issues when he stays in his lane on trade and economics. And Trump himself, they need to do what President Roosevelt has done with the fireside chats and reassure the public and educate the public. And I think part of the problem is that I don't know if that'll fully work with people outside his base, because his trust level has just been totally squandered. It's a disaster, which leads me into Doge. Pat, you have advised local governments, state governments, the federal governments for the past 40 to 50 years on efficiency, on operations. You have served in the private sector, even in, I believe, a VP within TRW Incorporated.
Yes, I was in charge.
And I know from when I was a part of CPA, the way people, including Michael Stuma, talked about you, that you were like a real brain when it came to making things work and whatnot. You were portrayed as brilliant, which you are. What do you think of Elon Musk's role in the administration? How him and Trump and the administration has handled Doge, locking workers out, firing workers, rehiring them, Elon going on and saying that, that we got to impeach these justices for reversing Doge's and the Trump administration's decisions. What do you think of this? Because I am concerned about this shift in the Republican Party. This is emblematic of something that's always been in modern so-called conservatism in the Republican Party, which is this sort of extreme form of callousness. This notion that let's deflect blame from the multi-billionaire, multi-millionaire individuals that have a lot of cash, have a lot of lobbying power, and the ability to make or break politicians through campaign finance so they can leverage the policies they want into any administration and senators, congressmen, state governments, etc. That's, to me, is the core of a lot of many of America's domestic problems, the source of it, as well as also problems of foreign policy that we've outlined before. And I see those people as being exalted as demigods, that we must bow down and kiss their feet. And that's reinforced by so-called conservative media. But yet, they point to the problems of America being caused by individual immigrants. And I'm not an open borders guy by any stretch, by the way. They blame immigrants, LGBTQ people, politically active minorities, all these groups that as individuals generally don't have a lot of individual power, but they're crapped all over. And that's always been part of the conservative playbook. We talked about Lee Atwater and Paul Rayrich's memos outlining that strategy. we're intimately familiar with it, as you said. I see this ugliness coming to a pinnacle with Doge, with the way a lot of MAGA voters are responding to people being fired, services being eliminated and cut. Now, I also take the view that there is legitimately waste in the government. There are abuses in procurement, like by defense contractors. Defense contractors, according to one statistic, the majority of the profits garnered by defense contractors are for stock buybacks and not even weapons production. Not to mention all of this unaccounted waste and fraud in the DoD. Not to mention, yes, there is, and the Heritage Foundation, you and I disagree with a lot of what they say policy-wise, but they have put convincing studies out that show waste and fraud in Medicare, Social Security, nothing to do with payment of benefits that people that legitimately need it. So there is this need for Doge, but the way they're doing it, they're not, and I'm going to want you to elaborate on your perspective, personal and professional. The way they should do it is as follows. And I'm going to reference a gentleman who's retired from the Broward County Library System that I've worked for almost 25 years full-time now, 27 years, including part-time. His name is Paul. I'm not going to give his last name. He was a head of a circulation department, a library specialist too at one point. He went to a library that needed to be made more efficient. He was sent there. And his approach, he's a good guy, down to earth, hard-nosed, but fun guy. But wanted the work done and done right as much as possible. He sat there when he got there, he got to know the people, but a lot of times he remained quiet and watched. Till after many months passed, then he sprung into action and made the changes he needed. And there are times he had to be firm, but he also wanted to get the buy-in from the people, a combination of buy-in and firmness. Trump, Musk, and the rest of Doge, I believe the Doge caucus in Congress is perhaps behind this. You have Stephen Miller, who's one of the top White House policy bigwigs. Some sources say he has played a huge role in this mess. They have done everything in the opposite of what Paul has done, and probably what you have done. I got to tell you, it's one of the many things that have squandered any scintilla of trust I had left in the Trump administration. Now it could potentially affect libraries throughout the country because they want to get rid of Trump, wants to get rid of funding for the Institute for Museum and Library Services. What do you think?
First, can we take a 2-minute break?
Sure.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Sure. All right. I'm going to leave this rolling, though, so I don't stop.
Okay.
Cool. Take your time.
Okay, I'm back.
All righty, no problem. All righty.
Okay, I'll pick it up on your question.
Okay.
Well, I think let's talk about Elon Musk first.
Mhm.
Elon Musk is at risk of being in the second Trump administration what the Pillow Man was in the first administration. He literally risked taking his enterprises into bankruptcy. In Germany, I saw a recent poll, only 3% of Germans will consider buying a Tesla. He has a factory there and it's a big market. Across Europe, his sales are off something like 55%. His stock has halved in value. You now got the Treasury Secretary literally urging people to buy Tesla stock. You had the White House do a show. His company is in trouble. And his trouble is himself, not his product as such. That's going to worsen as time goes on. Much of financing is based on the value of his stock. That's for SpaceX, that's for X, it's for Starlink, etc. His financing is probably being sustained, at least where it's foreign-based or sovereign fund-based, is because of his relationship with Trump as such. But I think his investors, if they're troubled now, they're going to be more troubled. So that's the first thing. And he has become, with that image of him and a chainsaw, what he is creating is organic resistance politically, and it is an organic resistance, as what happened with the Tea Party. Now, the Tea Party was funded by the Koch group primarily in its movement. This is not funded really by anyone in that sense. It is organic as people worry about their Social Security, as they worry about Medicaid, as these announcements that elderly people are going to have to go to Social Security offices that are being cut off. And then just, and again, this is happening without any effective resistance from the Democratic Party as such. Democratic Party is in the wilderness right now in dealing with this. So that's the first thing. His cuts are ideological that are happening. He's just wiping out agencies without any consideration of what's involved. The very fact that he's wiped out and had to replace on so many of the nuclear safety programs and the nuclear facilities simply says that they're just doing this indiscriminately to get down to a certain number. So I think that there will be dramatic weaknesses of our institutions and the services. All of these are for services. You know, I have been in governments for 15 years of my career, about a quarter of my career. And what you find in these agencies, primarily in those functions where you're not dealing one-on-one, are very dedicated, competent people in this country whose career is public service. They find satisfaction from it. They find economic security out of it, and by and large, they deliver the goods. On our R&D, for example, we're the finest R&D country in the world. Our research universities are the very finest in the world. NASA, for all of the inefficiencies, has actually put people on the moon, etc. So we will have that now. Let's assume that this is going to continue, and it will continue, I think, for 2 more years. and a great deal of damage will be done. So the question, the longer question I think that we need to figure is what happens afterwards? What do we do afterwards on that?
Mhm.
Here is a great opportunity to reset our institutions. For example, why is it that the United States spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare, and every other major industrial country spends between 10 and 12% and has better healthcare, even though we have the best health technology in the world? That needs to be rethought very clearly. Why is it that we find ourselves with great shortages of technical people? Here's an opportunity to rethink technical education. We have shifted over the past 50 years to move away from trades and skills and technologists, saying that everyone has to have a college degree. Well, a good machine tool operator is essential if you're having a manufacturing. Great electricians are important. Great plumbing skills are important. Have you tried to get a plumber recently to service? So we need to rethink our education system, and we're going to have an opportunity. So to me, this is being done badly. It's being done, it's going to be at great cost to Trump. It's going to be at a great cost to Musk. It's going to be at a great cost to the Republican Party. I mean, the Democrats, they have shown no leadership, are likely to take over the Senate and the House in the midterms, which means the last 2 years of Trump's administration will be even more chaotic and unproductive. But what is happening is an opportunity to rethink things for the next generation. And we need to start doing that thinking right now.
And my questions to you, my follow-up questions, I totally agree with you. But you and I think rationally.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Democratic and Republican parties are cooked. The Democrats, you have mentioned correctly, for the most part, even though, yes, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and others have gone on their anti-oligarch tours now. Look, I have severe disagreements with particularly AOC. She's affiliated with DSA. I have really not much there's nothing that I agree with on the DSA's goals. That's Democratic Socialists of America.
Right.
They're long-term goals. But the left elements of the left wing of the Democratic Party is really taking leadership right now in preventing this. And that's a double-edged sword. Bernie, I wouldn't put in that camp necessarily because he's not a true socialist, not anymore, arguably. AOC and others within most of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, House Progressive Caucus, are bona fide socialists, with a few exceptions who I like. Ro Khanna, I like Ro Khanna from California.
Right.
He's a capitalist. He's another one I would include in my administration. Dan DiMicco, who's
Right.
more right-wing, I would include in my administration.
Right.
Putting all those people aside, I see that as a double-edged sword where the Democrats, the left wing of the party, could potentially gain currency. But also, I'm also afraid that not only is the far left of the party going to gain more power, but also the corporate Democrats are protected by Wall Street and multinational corporate cash, and they're really not going to take advantage of this opportunity to create a sort of new balanced form of capitalism and a renewed sense on the value of certain government services. As a side point, we also have to realize there's a national security issue on the way how good Doge and all these government cutbacks are handled, because now it's affected certain civilian institutions associated with American national security soft power, notably USAID. Now, when I take a look at the press online, not just normal news sites and wire services, as well
Right.
as again going on Grok 3 and have that surveys all the international news propaganda. Hungary, Russia, China, Venezuela, the communists in this country, they all view as Doge and all the cutbacks as opportunities for the destruction of American soft power or proof that capitalism is destroying itself in the United States. That's not good, for my opinion. We also know, as you've heard, Pat, I'm sure, that intelligence reports, this is Trump's own government intelligence, saying that China and Russia are aggressively stepping up efforts to recruit laid off federal workers who are
Yes.
disgruntled.
Yes.
Thirdly, Musk is ideologically, well, first of all, I don't think he's a good man. I think he is a man who has tremendous amount of power that's gone to his head. I think he is consorting with not only enemy foreign powers like China and Russia for business and perhaps other reasons, but also on the other extreme, Argentina under Javier Milei, who has done similar very radical libertarian reforms in Argentina, which has had at best mixed results. On the one hand, inflation declining and account balances improving, but apparently also the lived experiences of many Argentines has not entirely improved. In fact, it has worsened, at least according to Milei's detractors. Musk is very close with him, and so is Trump. As you know, that's very public, and Musk has been advised, and Doge has been advised before Trump's victory on massive layoffs and across the board ideologically driven deregulation. I have a concern of a foreign hand in this Doge too as well, from hardline libertarian Argentina too as well. That's a problem because that's also not having the best results for Argentina, but that has split conservatives, libertarians versus everyone else in the United States. You have Milei supporters saying Milei is great, he's doing everything great, everything is improved. His opponents are saying the exact opposite. I think there's probably somewhere in the middle, barring me going to Argentina and living there for a couple of months. My other concern is the Republicans are not going to learn. Musk has tremendous amount of power over Trump, has donated massive amounts of money to Trump's 2024 campaign. Some say bailed it out. You have, as a result of Buckley versus Vallejo, Citizens United, the Bellotti decision, the McCutcheon decision, all that those horrible judicial rulings which have liberalized campaign finance rules that has resulted in a flood of corporate cash into the Republican Party. Combine that with an extreme libertarian ideology. And look, there are things I like about libertarianism economically as a general principles, barring the details. But this is that ideology combined with that amount of cash controls the Republican Party, combined with a paradigm shift towards a meaner, callous ideology within conservatism. And that kind of breaks my heart to say that. I think the Republican is cooked, and I don't think they're going to learn. I think I compare the Republican Party to like Afghanistan under the communists. Their ideas were not generally popular in Afghanistan, so they had to be bailed out by the Soviet Union and its allies. The same thing with the Republican Party. If truly we would sit down and have a debate that is publicized and constantly publicized day after day on mainstream media and debates, when you look at polls for issues like Social Security, Medicare, the Republicans lose on a lot of their economic agenda outside their diehard proponents. And the GOP is kept alive by just corporate cash, and that's it. And by a lot of propaganda from their media organs too as well. I hate to sound like a lefty, but I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've observed it. And I was involved somewhat in Republican campaigns, met a lot of good people, but the fact of the matter is I also met some very bad people that turned me off, including candidates. So my thing is our question, those are more of my observations, but my question is are the Republicans going to learn even in the long term? I think they're cooked. They're not going to learn. And the Democrats, I think they're just going to win by default and not take advantage of the opportunity. They're going to screw it up just like Obama did in his first term by not going full and hard against Reaganomics. Obama really didn't do that. The Democrats are not going to do that. And then you have the far left of the party. They're going to push an agenda that, to me, is deeply troubling too as well. What are your thoughts, Pat? Realistically, of what's going to happen? Am I crazy to think these thoughts, or?
No, I mean, I think they're very much on the money. What I would say is there is an enormous opportunity right before us at this point. And there are several things that we can do to reform our political institutions. I would suggest that you and your audience take a look at the full disclosure law that the state of Arizona has enacted and that will take effect in future elections, which has been tested in federal court, is set before the Ninth Circuit, which is opposed by Americans for Prosperity, the Koch organization. And this piece of legislation that says that anyone who runs for public office inside the state of Arizona must disclose the true funder of any campaign contributions. You can't hide behind a 501c3 or 501c4, etc. Who is the company or the person that puts up the money? It is a transparency law. I would move literally, just as you had the movement to have nonpartisan redistricting, which started in California and in New York, I would move to have full disclosure. Everybody needs to know who's putting the money behind these candidates. So that's the first thing. The second thing is hopefully we can find some groups, or somebody will fund some groups that will use Elon Musk's extraordinary contributions to move in and put real limits on campaign financing. In other words, challenge the 2010 Supreme Court decision that allowed unlimited money, dark money, to enter our campaigns. And basically say that we're going to return control of our democracy to people and not to a handful of billionaires that have bought both parties. And that is what's happened. A handful of billionaires and super rich have bought control of both parties as such. So we move to make that happen. We make that a major fight. And then we move on redistricting to end this gerrymandering activity. So all of a sudden, it'll never be a fair fight, but you can have much more of an equal fight. And we can shift it to where people have to fight it out on ideas and what they stand for. And we can shift it where people have to explain their relationships with the people that are funding them. And that becomes a legitimate political exercise as such. And it literally will focus attention on the funders. What do they want and get out of this? So that's the first thing. Elon Musk can be a very useful issue for political reform.
Yes.
So I think we start with that. I think also we've got to hope that the Democrats come up with an agenda that speaks to what they stand for now and what they propose. It just simply cannot be identity politics. It simply can't be opposition to Trump. What do they propose for the party? In other words, let's assume that we're going to be in a deep recession, and let's assume that many of the institutions we know are not only gone, or if they exist, they're crippled as such. It's almost Franklin Roosevelt in the first 100 days. Franklin Roosevelt, with Rexford Tugwell and a series of others, designed that program in the 2 years before he stood for election. And he experimented with it in New York State. Many of those programs were tested. The question, can the Democrats do that at this point? Do they have the intellectual capacity to come up with ideas? And do they have the communication skill to get people to accept something that's in their own benefit and the national benefit? And then how do they marginalize those politicians inside the party that are basically simply in it for power as such, and personal aggrandizement or personal benefit? Oh, I would do one other thing as part of this, and I would use Trump as the basis for doing this. And that is, I would design a series, or I would design legislation where it would be impossible to put money in the president's pocket or benefit the president and his family as such. We want our president to have no allegiance to his own pocketbook or to making his family wealthy as such to be our leader. They've got to be, it's got to be transparent, and they've got to be in simply to do their job as defined under the Constitution. And I think that can become a very powerful power. In other words, bring life to the emoluments clause.
There you go. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's almost verbatim on everything. And also a lifetime lobbying ban too for federal, state, local officials, workers, whatever. Lifetime ban. So any closing? Oh, go ahead.
No, I think on these issues is these need to be standalone issues. And they've got to be standalone, and they've got to be simply explained. You have some bad examples. Elon Musk and all this money is a really glaring example of how much more power this individual has than each of us, and how they can intimidate, how they can affect, as they're trying to do in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, like write down and simply how they can intimidate. I know many Republicans who hate what is happening with Doge, but they're intimidated into silence as such. The same thing is happening with law firms. I don't know if you saw that one of the law firms that Trump threatened just cut a deal with him that basically they will not mount lawsuits against him or what he's doing, and they'll contribute $40 million into public service to charities that Trump picks. Now, I would never hire that law firm, ever. I mean, because that they're flunkies as such. So, we need to make that illegal as such. The Bar Association and the judiciary's got to take that on. If they don't take that on, then that's got to be one of those reform issues that we take on. Everyone must have the right to pick a lawyer who is not conflicted when they represent you, that cannot be intimidated.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Getting back before we conclude, and I know there's a lot of information out there, a lot of topics, but Republicans who are upset with Doge, are these elected officials? These are, or
Yes,
voters, or both?
both.
And what are they specifically upset about Doge and the Trump administration? I don't ask you to give names or anything of people.
The basic thing is the attempt to destroy law. Literally, the thing that the courts are taking on. President does not have the authority to cancel an agency that was created by Congress. Does not have that authority. The president does not have the authority to impound funds. The Article 2 power he has is to faithfully administer the laws that are passed by the Congress, to spend the monies that the Congress appropriates. He does not have the power to shift monies or to withhold monies. And there, if he wishes to do so, there are very specific congressional provisions of how that can be done. So this breaking of the bounds here is a major concern. This attack on the judiciary is very troubling to these people, as it is to me. I'll speak for myself. It is very troubling. The rule of law is central to our democracy.
And it's very troubling to me too, because he's not even using his political capital to ride over the Supreme Court on issues like the campaign finance decisions, which would be, if he handled it properly and chose that route, would be hugely popular if it was communicated well constantly to the people. But instead, he's engaging in actions that are just dividing people, that is weakening American power, that's antagonizing a lot of people, including laid off federal workers, to be possible targets for espionage by Russia and China. So yeah, it's just the Trump administration. I would say 90+% of it is a train wreck. It is a disaster. My faith in, and I've used this as a conclusion, my faith in the Republican Party has been, for many years, has been damaged severely. This basically was the final knife stab in the heart of any scintilla of any credibility with much of the Republican Party. And that's sad. And I don't want to be partisan, because I have a lot of critiques of the Democrats. Yes, there are a handful of Democrats that I like by Democratic Party standards, but this is a disaster. I would love to, honestly, Pat, to become a Republican again. And maybe 20 years down the road, when your grandkids are older, and if I have grandkids, maybe down the road, maybe there will be a changed Republican Party. There could very well be. It is possible. I mean, American history does have its gyrations. I'll close with this quote of hope. Winston Churchill said in 1947, he said, the Americans will try every single solution, and they'll wait at the last possible moment. After everything's exhausted, the last thing we'll do is do the right thing. I'm mangling the quote, but I know you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly. Can I offer one thought about the two parties?
Sure.
And I say this, having spent 8 years with Ross Perot, trying to build a third party, the Reform Party, which did get more votes than any other third party attempt. We got 19% in the 1992 election. It is very hard. The conclusion that I came away from that with after the 92 election and what we had to go through, what we went through, is that the only way for real political reform is going to have to be made within the confines of the two parties. I tried very hard, as long as a couple of other people, to get Ross Perot to run for the Republican nomination in 1996. He was so adverse to the corruption and the difficulties in the two parties that he went with the Reform Party as such. It can't be done. with a third party. It has to be done within the confines of the two parties. And so the challenge is to figure a way to do that with one party or the other. If we can do it with one party, the other party, to a great extent, will have to follow. The Republican Party right now is headed towards the same crash that the Democratic Party did with Joe Biden. And so, again, there's an opportunity. These two parties need to be rebuilt. The immediate opportunity is the Democratic Party, is to literally get it to make the changes that can speak for most of the American people. And so, that to me, the first challenge is to get the massive money out. This has got to be a public function. We've got to have public financing and individual contributions financing our campaigns. We cannot have our leaders beholden to private or foreign interest.
I think you hit upon an important point, the two-party system. And you're right. And I know I've read about the experience of the Reform Party in 1992 versus 1996, and when the two-party system formed the Commission on Presidential Debates and slowly strangled as a result of that and other things, the viability of third parties. With that stated, I think a good starting point would be to get a brains trust together, to get people like you, Michael Lind, Julius Krein, various disparate elements from the Alliance for American Manufacturing, the CPA, certain business and union groups that are on our side. I've become a little more active in the union I belong to, and they're actually surprisingly centrist, even some cases on certain issues conservative leaning rather than very far left. I think there's hope out there. I would love to be a part of that effort. I think other people, I think, we would disagree with them on domestic issues, but people like Nyquist and others on foreign policy and the threat of Russia and China would be good in the coalition. Develop this powerful coalition, sit down, talk civilly, find out what we agree with, come to an agreement on what the common problems are plaguing the United States, causing the problems that we're constantly pointing out, and then figure out strategies on how to get into the Republican and Democratic Party. My impression is there'll be a tremendous amount of resistance. We would need to handpick people that are shrewd political operators, people like intellectuals, let them put out position papers and everything else, then have communications people that are effective at communicating, then also have people who are smooth political operators or a combination of everything, and then start entering the Democratic and Republican Party and slowly winning people over on the most local of levels. And there are going to be times where there are going to be Republican or Democratic precincts that are going to be hostile to us, where it's going to be impossible to do that. But we have to know our terrain. So those are some ideas that I have on starting that.
Well, the Democrats in 81, 82 did that after their colossal defeat to Reagan and the Republicans. They created something on the Yellow Brick Road that Dick Gephardt and Bill Bradley and a couple of others did. And they helped define an agenda and created an organization, the Democratic Leadership Council. And so they did that. The Heritage Foundation did that over the last 4 years for the Republicans. What is needed is some institution and some funder to stand up and be the central or the convening authority and set and lay this out. And as they start to come up with ideas that have appeal, they'll get attraction, they'll get candidates, etc. All of these candidates right now are prospective candidates are flailing around looking for some ideas. So what you're proposing is a great idea, and it's very timely. What is needed is an organization and funders.
Well, I would pick the funders too. There are
Yeah,
wealthy people out there. There's people like Nick Hanauer, for
yeah,
example, you may have heard of. I think there are people within the Coalition for a Prosperous America, the union organizations, business groups or business labor groups like the Coalition for a Prosperous America, Alliance for American Manufacturing, and people can do work in also their local chambers of commerce too as well. And I think that's some good starts. I understand people struggle to keep their businesses afloat. It is very hard and not always easy to be an entrepreneur or even a big business person. It is hard work. You're married to the business. And I have respect for our business people and for many things, and that includes that. But I think that's where we need to get started. And any closing comments? This has been a great show. I know it's gone longer than expected, but I think there's just a lot of ideas to be hashed out.
I've greatly enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to continuing it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Pat, where can people find your published works?
Basically, just go to the internet. You will find them there. I suggest that you can buy my books on Amazon. I suggest buy them secondhand. They'll cost you $1 or $2 if you want them. And, for the articles and other stuff, go to the Harvard Business Review or the New York Times or the Washington Post. I've published extensively there.
Yeah, that's the inflation special that Pat is giving. Buy them secondhand. Thank you so much, Pat. It's always been great. Maybe one of these days, if you ever come to Florida, we'll get together. Or if I go to Arizona, maybe I'll plan a trip to Arizona and we'll get together.
God, it's a beautiful state. It's a beautiful state.
Yeah, my grandmother, my mother's late parents, they had a place in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it's beautiful out there. I love the scenery.
I love the desert.
All righty. Thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate it. We'll definitely have to have you back on the show. Everyone, God bless America. Good luck. Let's pray that we get through this administration, its challenges, its geopolitical threats we're faced, and just pray a lot and hope for the best and work hard to make this a better country. Thank you all. Have a great day and enjoy your weekend and be safe.